Tonight's Fireside Chat is hosted by Interna and is the first of a series where we ask today's leaders technology, what they have learned, and how to innovate on product, strategy, and technology. The interview will be conducted by David Subar. David is the founder and managing partner of Interna, a consultancy that enables technology companies to ship better products faster, to achieve product market fit more quickly, and to deploy capital more efficiently. Interna has worked with companies ranging in size from small 6-member startups to the Walt Disney Company and helped Pluto on its way to a $320 million sale to Paramount and Lynda.com on the path to its $1.5 billion sale to LinkedIn. Prior to founding Interna, David was CTO and CPO of a number of companies, including Zest Finance, Break Media, and Interthinks. He currently serves on the board of directors of the LA CTO Forum. Our special guest for tonight is Kevin Goldsmith. Kevin has been a developer, software architect, technology manager, and senior technology executive for over 28 years. He's the chief technology officer at Anaconda, overseeing innovation for Anaconda's current open source and commercial offerings and developing new solutions to bring data science practitioners together with innovators, vendors, and thought leaders in the industry. Formerly, Kevin was the chief technology officer at Onfido, chief technology officer at Avo, the vice president of engineering consumer at Spotify, and director of engineering at Adobe Systems and development lead at Microsoft. If you have questions for tonight's guest, direct message or tweet at David directly on Twitter at dsubar, that's at DSUBAR, or you can follow the link on his Clubhouse profile. Additionally, in the final part of tonight's interview, you may raise your hand and ask your questions directly on stage. Questions will be answered in the order they are received. And now for the interview.
Great. Well, hello, Kevin, and thank you for doing this with us. Glad to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Thanks. Just for everyone in the audience, I got to know Kevin through an interesting argument we had. I was giving a presentation to the Seattle CTO Club and talking about various methodologies of how product managers and engineers might work together. And I talked about the Spotify model, and which, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a way that companies have been following Spotify in the way that they've developed teams and software for releases. And people are copying the model almost word for word. And I had pointed out about an article where someone from Spotify said the model itself doesn't work. And Kevin raised his hand and said to me, David, and I'm going to paraphrase. Kevin's a much nicer person than I am. He said, David, you don't understand. That's actually not correct. And so we got into a conversation. We got an offline conversation. I thought it would be. I thought what Kevin had to say was very insightful and had a unique perspective for reasons that'll become immediately obvious, and was right in a lot of ways that I wasn't. So that's the conversation tonight. So let me just kick it off with what is an obvious question is, Kevin, why do you know so much more about this than I do?
Well, I worked there for 3 years. So I joined Spotify a few months after the original white paper on how the company organized themselves was published. And I was there for 3 years as we grew from a few hundred developers up to about 800 or so by the time I left. And I saw how that system that Spotify created scaled and worked. And so I feel very protective of it, but I also feel very strongly just because I saw it work very well.
Great. So just before we get into the what the Spotify method really is, some of the stuff you and I talked about. Let's talk about what people are following as a method for developing products, about the squads and tribes and those components. Just walk us through what the outside implementation is just for a moment, and then we can talk about what it really is.
So, absolutely. So when you hear the interesting thing about the Spotify model is people condense it down to a few of the keywords: squads, tribes, guilds, chapters. These are essentially ways to organize software development teams. It is at heart a matrix model organization where that means essentially that someone working in a team reports to someone who may or may not be in that team. For example, all the web developers report to someone who manages the web developers. That person may be in their team or they may be in a completely different team. That is what defines a chapter. A squad is a group that maybe works on a set of features. For example, in Spotify, the search that you have in the product that's managed by what used to be called, I don't know if the name has changed since I left, but the BFS, the first search squad. So they write all the search code. And that has people who are front-end developers and back-end developers and mobile developers, and they collectively own that feature. A group of those teams, those squads, are grouped together in what's called a tribe. That would be, for example, when I joined, I was the tribe lead of the music player tribe, and we owned a lot of the features in the product. As we grew, we created a new thing called alliances, which were collections of tribes, and I became an alliance lead. And, that's what people think of, a very simplest version of the Spotify model.
Great. Thank you. And so this has become one of the popular models for technology companies to emulate in organizing developers, product managers into alignment with features and users. And so people are copying it one for one. And then there was this other paper that came out. So there were two videos and maybe papers that came out of Spotify that described it. And then there was this other paper that came out that said, what did it say?
So are you talking about the squad goals one?
No, I'm talking about the one that said, hey, this actually doesn't work. Spotify doesn't actually use it.
Yeah,
I guess I just said what the paper
said. That's the failed squad goals one. So there's been like any, I would say if you think of like agile software development, there's lots of people telling you how great agile software development is, and then there's people who have either like tried agile and it didn't work for whatever reason. Sometimes it's there's lots of reasons why you might try it and it didn't work as well as you hoped. And so there has been, Spotify really doesn't talk about the Spotify model anymore. Partially because Spotify never cared whether you used it or not. There have been there's been more than one blog post of companies that have said either we tried it and it doesn't work at all, this is all a lie, or the article you're talking about came from someone that was a contract product manager at the company for like 5 months, wrote a blog post saying this entire thing is a lie, and basically did a hit piece on it, and has gotten tremendous amounts of traction because a lot of people have heard how great it is. They love hearing that it doesn't work at all. So that's the article you're talking about. That one, right. Yeah, that's it's disappointing. It's disappointing when somebody can write something like that is kind of a personal attack on something where they weren't successful, and just declare that it failed and gets a lot of notice for it. But it happens. There's plenty of articles about lots of things that are like that.
Yeah, but I'm gonna make the following argument: is for a lot of people the Spotify model doesn't work, and I'm gonna argue that there's two reasons.
Okay.
One is because they didn't actually follow the Spotify model as outlined in the document. Second is they shouldn't have started using the Spotify model in the first place. And I'm going back to the conversation, Kevin, you and I had about misunderstanding what was the driver of the Spotify model. And so maybe that hit piece was correct because because people didn't understand what the Spotify model really was, right? He was critiquing something he shouldn't have been critiquing, is what I'm arguing.
He actually did work at Spotify.
I get that.
Yeah. So I think the thing is, I wrote a blog post that has been a popular saying, you should not do the Spotify model. And I wrote it while I still worked at Spotify. And the main reason I wrote it was, as I said a minute ago, Spotify never cared if you did the Spotify model. Spotify wasn't a consultancy. Spotify wasn't selling you software development organizational models. We talked about it for two reasons. One, we talked about it because it worked really well and we wanted to share knowledge. The other reason we talked about it was we were employer branding, right? We were trying to tell people, like, hey, look at this cool thing we're doing. Like, a lot of companies post about how great, how things work at the company because they're trying to find people who are interested in working that way. Spotify, we never talked about this because we were encouraging other companies to do it. So that's an important thing. Because a lot of what made the Spotify model work was the Spotify culture. And that's what I said in my post, because I kept talking to companies that would try and copy it. We wrote one white paper that was like 4 pages long that described it, which is not enough if you're going to go and do this in your own company. But companies tried, and it didn't work because they didn't understand it. We didn't give them enough information. And their culture was very different than Spotify's. And then later, the reason we made the 2 videos was because we were a little tired of people telling us, you keep saying how great this is. You're obviously lying because nothing works that well. And part of the intent with the videos was to talk about the things that didn't work as well at Spotify. Like, we wanted to be very open and transparent about it because we knew other companies were trying it, and we were trying to give them, a little bit more insight. It is. It's interesting in the time, when I was at Spotify, I was there for a few years. Companies kept trying to adopt it and kept failing, and it was because they didn't have the right culture to support it. And then in the time since I've left, there's been some companies, more companies have actually found success with it. And I think part of it is because there's a lot of people that have left Spotify that are training or working with companies now, and more information's out. And also I think people have learned to take the ideas and not necessarily the specifics and apply that in their own company. So ING, for example, is a company that took the Spotify model, changed it for their culture, and applied it on a massive scale. And it's been, as far as I know, last time I talked to people there, it's been working great for them.
So I thought was really interesting when you and I talked about was the fundamental thing that I think that you're touching on now, but you had, I think you mentioned someone else when we did our one-on-one, fundamental thing people are missing about the development of the Spotify model, about the attributes that were picked and how. Can you talk about, do you know what I'm referring to? And can you talk about that for a little? Yeah.
One of the things that's made Spotify as successful as it has been, Spotify, Daniel Ek, very, very early on, understood that in the end there was only going to be 2, maybe 3 streaming music companies, and one of them was going to be either Amazon or Apple. So there was maybe room for one startup, and for that reason, he really took, he and Martin, the founders, really took a blitz scaling approach. Now, if you can imagine, you need to grow as quickly as possible. You know that you're already in a very crowded space. You need to out-innovate everyone. So building in a very traditional kind of top-down hierarchical way is probably not going to work well for you. And especially if you're coming really out of a Swedish culture, which has a strong belief in equality and autonomy, that model is not great for that culture. So they took a very sort of agile first, very kind of make sure that as we scale, we don't lose speed. And they started, the initial thing was very more traditional, kind of organized. They had some problems. They were starting to slow down. they made a decision to make a pretty radical change, which is what developed that first version of that kind of cross-functional matrix model, which then brought in an idea of like continuously looking to improve and update and change as needed, which then helped them grow the model very, very significantly and grow and do well as the company grew. So that was an important innovation, and one of the reasons why they started with this very early, because they wanted to make sure as they grew the teams that they didn't have that kind of slowing down that you get when you're just building really deep hierarchies.
So each of these teams are relatively independent or completely independent.
They're the true model is they're 100% autonomous. We worked, me as a leader of an organization, I worked incredibly hard to make sure that the teams had no hard dependencies between each other.
Got it. So now I'm developing some code to do something. Let's say it's I'll try to come up with a good example. I want to display a particular kind of widget on the iPhone. Now, you're in a different team.
Yeah.
How do we prevent your team from duplicating the code I'm doing to be inefficient at code development?
So,
if they're completely autonomous.
Right. So you don't care. It is not a model designed for efficiency in any way, shape, or form. So the Spotify model is not an efficient way to build software development organizations, because the requirements of autonomy mean if we're not creating strict dependencies between our two teams, we may absolutely duplicate effort, and that's expected. You don't go out of your way to make that happen, but you certainly would rather have it happen than have me wait on you to do something. And that is by design.
Got it. Right. So you and I and maybe 5 other teams might be developing the same thing, and that's okay.
Yep. That's absolutely okay. So the trick, the thing we're going to look for, the thing me as a tribe lead and an alliance lead, or the architect, what we're looking for is we don't want two different teams. Like, we're trying to make sure that the two teams have enough distance between them that you're not building your own search for the product. If my team is a search team, no one else should be building search in the product. That's the kind of level we looked at it. But if it means that, I have this spinner widget to select something, and you build a completely different spinner widget, and that's fine. Like, that's okay. And in fact, actually, I'd say, like, if you looked at Spotify 2013, 2014, up until 2015, where we actually really did a big effort to kind of consolidate similar controls to work the same, you could tell, we used to call it, we would show the organizational underwear in the product, because the same kind of control would work different in different parts of the same window, because there's two different teams writing it. And that was okay. Like, that, we were okay with that.
So what forced that consolidation to say this spinner widget, these two spinner widgets are have the same purpose but are different, and we don't want to do that anymore? What forced that, and how did that change the model?
A big part of it, honestly, was Rochelle King, who was the head of UX. She'd come from Netflix. She's actually back at Netflix now. So she joined a little bit before I did, and there was a point where it was pretty obnoxious to look at the app and see. You could, if you knew what the squads were, you could definitely tell different teams were writing the app, like looking at one window. And so there was an effort to figure out how to make design consistent without interfering with team autonomy. So that was a big thing that her and her team kind of figured out a way, without forcing everyone to kind of, subscribe to a team that would build the controls for them, to allow teams to move forward, but do it in a more consistent way. So there was, I forget which version it was, or the date around it, but it was like that 2014, 2015 timeframe where we, piece by piece, basically completely converted the app to a consistent set of design metaphors And for the controls that were nearly identical, we actually said, okay, like there's no reason to have two of these now that these are kind of done. So we did do that process, but from that point forward, yeah, if I need a control, I'm not going to ask somebody else to do it. We'll just make it. And that was expected.
And now what about things that couldn't have been different, like security or authentication? How was that handled? And feel free to answer that question and also say the question's not relevant because it depends on what your culture is. But for this model where you want autonomy, let's talk about that. And then I want to get meta about it and think about how do you think about the models.
So authentication was owned by a squad. So a single team owned authentication. So that wasn't really, it was fine. Most parts of the app didn't really need to do a separate authentication. So you only authenticate once and then, you're authenticated. Security was actually interesting because when I joined, we had security-minded people, but we didn't really have a security team. That grew while I was there, but they acted very much as consultants as opposed to a team that owned security. So teams were expected to build secure code. They had access to a group of experts that could help them. And help them do that, would occasionally go and poke around and make sure we weren't doing silly things. But that was how we did it. Again, we had to maintaining squad autonomy was paramount.
Okay, let me just pause for 1 second. Let's do a room reset. Actually, Alexander, I'll let you do that if you could.
Sure. So for the first thing, just as for those of you who are just now joining us, we're doing a technology and product manager fireside chat. Tonight's fireside chat is hosted by Interna, and it's the first of a series where we ask today's leaders in product and technology what they've learned, how to innovate on product, strategy, and technology. The interview is conducted by David Subar, and our special guest tonight is Kevin Goldsmith. I'll go ahead and let both of you do a more casual introduction of yourselves.
You can start, Kevin.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Kevin Goldsmith. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Anaconda today. I have been a CTO for the last 5 years at different companies in Seattle and in the UK. And prior to that, I was a VP of engineering at Spotify from 2013 to 2016. I was also a director at Adobe. I was there for 9 years. I was at Microsoft for 8 years, and various other startups and other companies over the years.
Thank you, Kevin. So Kevin is I've gotten to know Kevin recently, but I will say that he's also being somewhat modest. He's a super smart guy who knows a lot about not just about technology, but about how technology is developed and how teams and how things. Very insightful thinker and also not shy. So was able to. No, that's great. That's not a criticism. That's you and I engaged because you taught me something, and so I'm super happy about that. I'm David Subar. I am the managing partner and founder at Interna. I've been CTO and Chief Product Officer of a number of companies as well, but been at Interna for 8 years, where we help technology companies think about how to develop product more effectively, how to lean startup model type thing, how to build fast, ship fast, get product market, get feedback from the product, and do it again and again. And I'm also on the board of directors of the LACTL Forum. So let's go back to part of the conversation we're having. So
before we jump in, David, I just want to say, if anyone has a question for tonight, feel free to direct message or tweet at David directly on Twitter. His handle is at DSubar. That's at DSUBAR. Or you can follow the link on his Clubhouse profile. And additionally, in the final part of tonight's interview, anyone can raise their hand and ask your question directly on stage. Questions will be answered in the order they are received. So, and that's all, just real quick. Just wanted to throw that out there for anyone who has a question so far.
I think Kevin might have also had contact information that he wanted to share if people wanted to reach out to him later too. So, Alexander, if you could share that.
So you can reach Kevin on Twitter at Kevin Goldsmith, as it's spelled KevinGoldsmith, or at his website, kevingoldsmith.com, which I believe that information is in his bio as well.
Yep.
Great. So we were talking about authentication and different services that were by necessity forced to be shared by other groups. Actually, I'm gonna dig in this a little bit more before I kind of get more meta about it. How did you, I've seen this problem in a lot of companies, right, where you have shared services, things that are horizontal, that other people have to build on top of. And Kevin, the point that you made before about don't constrain me by time having to wait on your service that you have to build, which is why in the Spotify model, things were as independent as possible. But was there any particular fix for things that had to be horizontal that everybody had to integrate with? Was there any particular fix at Spotify about how to make that not overly constraining?
Yeah, so we did occasionally have things like that. There was, I actually wrote about this, and we put this in the video as well, because that was one of the things that I wanted, because Henrik Nieberg, who was also one of the authors of the original white paper, did the videos in 2015. But I helped him a little bit around it, and one of the things I wanted to talk about was that worked horribly. That was not great at Spotify. We were not organized to do large-scale cross-team projects. That's just not the way that was not the way the model was designed. It was designed to do a lot of innovation in parallel, not to do kind of large-scale, multi-team, big deliverable efforts. We did do them. We got better at them because we were very, very good as an organization at learning. So we did some very poorly, and spent a lot of time trying to understand why it didn't work. And then one of the things I did at Spotify was I was the engineering lead for something we called Spotify Now, which none of you know unless you happen to watch the press event in 2015, in the spring of 2015, because that didn't work very well. The project worked fairly well. That involved several hundred people all working together, but we found at that point we kind of made the mistakes enough times that we found a way to kind of keep the group moving forward without trying to control too much the deliverables of any individual team. And that was about the best way we had to make it work, these kind of big projects. But we were really not well organized for that kind of thing. So, for example, one of the things that happened while I was there, another thing, we had to move to Trusty, a different version of Linux, because the version that we were using was basically end-of-lifed. And that meant changing several thousand servers to the new operating system. That took us, I believe, about 8 months. And it took us about 8 months because every squad had to decide when they wanted to do it. And no one could make them do it together because that's not what we did. So, that gives you a sense, that gives you that kind of sense. We were able to do these big projects. We were never good at them because that's not how we were structured.
So I'm going to go meta now. So you had touched on a little earlier today, and when we talked about what was important here is not the Spotify model. it's creating a model that represents the attributes of the company, the needs of the company. We're talking about a little bit in Spotify. How would you think about that, or is there a way to think about that generically for a company of starting from first principles of what attributes we want to get to and doing a model behind that? You were at Microsoft. I don't know if you were at Microsoft. They still had PUMs. I think we talked about this a little bit. Yeah. That was a model that worked when you were shipping silver discs, maybe not so well as online. Adobe, I don't know what they used. And maybe they weren't even, maybe neither of those examples were they even as thoughtful about what the process should be. But how would you think about understanding the attributes before you define the model?
So I think the critical thing, and the thing Spotify did exceptionally well, was it understood its own culture, and it was very careful and thoughtful about its culture. So that went everywhere from hiring to promotion to career advancement and to the way we organized the teams. So, when I advise startups today, I talk to them a lot about, understanding the culture they have and understanding the culture they're trying to build, and starting from that first. Understand your values. Your culture comes from the values. Everything else should come from your culture. And because of that, that strong cultural set of values that Spotify had, they built a software development model that supported those values, that reinforced those values, but then also made sense for the business that they were trying to develop. And so that's an important part. So when people think about the Spotify model, and even when people say things like, the Spotify model is a lie, or that's not the way it worked, and they worked at Spotify, and I'm not saying the author of that one articles is that, a lot of times different squads work differently, different tribes work differently, different alliances work differently. Each part of our organization was constantly experimenting on how to work better, and that was really the core idea of that. To me, that's actually what Spotify did exceptionally well. It wasn't the specific structures of squads or chapters or guilds or tribes or any of that stuff. It was that each of our units of organization was a little laboratory where we were just constantly trying to figure out the best way to do things, which meant that my tribe worked differently than the tribe literally on the next floor. They did things differently. They did things in their own way. And when they did things that worked really well, like, we would steal their ideas. And when we did something good, they would steal our ideas. And that's how the model just was continually evolving. It was in a state of constant change. So any one of those white papers or videos was really just marking a moment in time for one part of the organization. So, that was the critical idea of Spotify to me, was really this real effort around constant innovation and constant experimentation about how we could do things better.
So I think all that's interesting, but let me dig in on how did you steal, right? So that implies that there was some way of transferring knowledge among the teams, among the squads.
Yeah.
How did that work? So
this actually comes back to one of the things that we did at Spotify, which was this notion of guilds. Spotify didn't invent organizations that cross team boundaries, right? Companies in the 50s that had social clubs or softball teams, softball team was a guild, right? But Spotify was very understanding of the fact that because these teams were so autonomous, they really became silos that have very little contact with each other. And that's not necessarily a great thing for an organization, because you want best practices to emerge. So that's where the guilds, which were essentially cross-company groups that were voluntary participation. But, for example, all the mobile developers were in a guild. All the back-end developers were in a guild. All the agile coaches were in a guild. And what that meant was those were opportunities for good ideas to percolate across the organization. So that helped kind of break through those silos. And people were very serious about There were kind of more work guilds, there were more fun guilds, but people were actually pretty serious about being in their work, the guild of people that did a similar job as them, and good ideas would come that way. Another thing is that we never thought we'd solved it all. So we, as being part of the senior tech leadership of the company, we were constantly going out and visiting other companies. Other companies would come and visit us, just to see what they were doing and to see if they were doing anything interesting, or if they had a different take on something. And we would share. We were very happy to share ideas and learn from other companies, because we knew that we could take those ideas, bring them in, and do our version of them to help us work better. So, that was another aspect where we were constantly looking, not just within the company, but also outside the company, to see who was doing interesting things.
Got it. Alexander, thank you, Kevin. Alexander, would you like to do a reset?
Sure. So for those of you who are just now joining us or joining us in the past few minutes, we're doing a fireside chat tonight. And tonight's fireside chat is hosted by Interna and is the first of a series where we ask today's leaders in product and technology what they've learned and how to innovate on product, strategy, and technology. The interview is conducted by David Subar, and our special guest tonight is Kevin Goldsmith. So I'll give them both a chance to introduce themselves a little bit more fully. But before that, I want to quickly say, if you have a question for tonight's guest, feel free to direct message or tweet at David directly on Twitter at DSubar, that's at DSUBAR, or follow the link on his Clubhouse profile. Additionally, in the final part of tonight's interview, we will be accepting raised hands to ask your questions directly on stage, and questions will be answered at that point in the order they are received. If you're interested in contacting David, again, on Twitter at DSubar, at DSUBAR, or on LinkedIn, David Subar, or on the Interna website, interna.com/contact. If you're interested in reaching out to Kevin after tonight, feel free to reach out on Twitter at Kevin Goldsmith, KevinGoldsmith, or at his website, kevingoldsmith.com. So I'll go ahead and let you both introduce yourselves. Kevin, if you want to go first, and then David, if you want to follow up, and then continue.
Actually, let me try to introduce Kevin. So I think I got it.
That sounds good. That sounds perfect.
I think I got it down. So Kevin has been involved in technology for more than 28 years, or approximately 28 years. He's been a developer, an architect, an engineering manager, a CTO, general technology executive. He's seen a lot of different things. He's been at a number of companies, some of which are big brands that you know. We're talking tonight about Spotify, where he was a VP. He was also at Microsoft early in his career, and at Adobe, where he was a director. And he's been CTO of a number of places, at a legal technology legal marketplace. And Kevin, if I screw up the pronunciation, please let me know. Avo.
Yeah.
Thank you. He's CTO now at Anaconda. He'd previously been CTO at Fido. So Kevin comes to us with a ton of experience and a ton to learn from him. And we met when I gave a presentation recently at the Seattle CTO Club, and I was talking about organization between CTOs, CPOs, and CEOs, and conversations they should have. And we got engaged in talking about the Spotify model, and Kevin disabused me of some notions that I had about it. So that's how we got to get to know each other and spend some time together. I myself have been CTO and Chief Product Officer of a number of companies, and I'm currently Managing Director at Interna, which is a consultancy where we help technology companies run the lean startup model. How do you build quickly, release quickly, get feedback, do it again and again? We've done work with everything from small startups to the Walt Disney Company and the Disney ABC Television Group, helped a bit on envisioning how Disney Plus should work with lynda.com as they were helping them scale to get them sold to LinkedIn for $1.5 billion, and a bunch of other companies too. So Kevin and I come to this both very interested and engaged about how do you develop product effectively, how do you solve problems, and that's what we started talking about. So we're talking tonight about the Spotify model, what it is and what it isn't, and things to be learned from it. So I invite people, if they'd like to ask questions, they can go ahead and tweet at me at @dsubar or raise their hands now, and if not, I'll keep asking Kevin my questions, and we'll do that. So feel free, if you want to ask questions directly, to raise your hand. But so Kevin, you've seen a lot of different companies, and I'm not familiar with the size of the Anaconda and some of these other companies, but some were clearly startups, some were very large. I remember you and I you were talking about Microsoft taking up all of Redmond now, which I visited there, was not a thing. There was a lot of open green space.
Yeah,
clearly, Now it's all Bill land everywhere, except Bill's not there himself. What do you think the takeaways are from a company like Microsoft that pivoted when the internet came out in ways that were surprising for a large company to do, that are attributes that other companies that are smaller than Microsoft, because almost everyone is, could reasonably take with them?
So the things Microsoft did well that smaller companies could learn from?
Or Microsoft or other large companies, like Adobe's a large company as well, Spotify,
Yeah. So, the interesting thing was, and actually my old boss from Microsoft is in the room. When I was at Microsoft, I have to say, I really did not like working at Microsoft. And at the time, I thought, and which is a funny thing to say, given that I worked there 8 years. And at the time, I thought that the company was just organized very, very silly and didn't make sense at all. And what I later realized was, it's hard to point at a company that was, at the time when I was there. So I was there 94 to 2000, and then I came back for 2 years, 2002 to 2004. It was by far the most successful software company in existence at that time. It was doing a lot of things very, very well. It just was, I was not a good fit for the Microsoft culture. I was just not the right person. And later, it really took me a while to really understand, Microsoft was living its culture. It was just that I was the wrong person for that company. And but the way that company worked, especially when I was there, you still needed to do the build G reviews, right? It was very top down, very kind of industrial model company. But because of that, Bill decided it's time we get serious about the internet, and boom, we got serious about the internet. He wrote the memo, everybody's stuff changed. Because it was maybe 50,000 person company, it didn't change the next day, but it changed pretty quickly. And so I think the things that I would learn, or the things that I think made sense now, looking back at my time there, was, hey, they knew their culture. They built stuff. It comes back to the same thing I just said about Spotify. Microsoft was actually understood who they wanted to be, how they wanted to work. I think the one thing they didn't do as well as like a Spotify was they weren't articulate about it. They were very much like a lot of big companies where they would talk about collaboration and all these kind of big, fun HR words. But in the actuality, it was a super competitive environment, and proudly so. And so I think that was part of my problems. There was a lot of dissonance between what the company would say, but actually how things were. Adobe is a very different company than Microsoft. And I think it had a little bit of that problem, sort of what the company says and what the company does. But at the same time, I think people there understood, like, it lived its values in its own way. And that made it, so it was not nearly as top down. There was a lot more autonomy. There was a lot more support for internal innovation. but that was kind of who that company was, and the company knew who it was, and it knew how it worked. And if you were there and you worked in that way, I was much more compatible with the Adobe culture than I was with the Microsoft one. So I was very successful, and I quickly learned. Okay, I understand. It didn't take me nearly as long as it did with Microsoft to really understand. Okay, I see how we are, and I see how this makes sense for me. But it kind of knew who it was. Spotify knows who it is. And it's changed, by the way. Spotify today is very, very different than Spotify when I was there. I left the company 5 years ago. So if it was the same as it is, I think, several thousand. When I left, it was about 3,000 people. Today, I think it's over 10,000. I don't know for certain. It's a very different company because one of the things that Spotify was really good at was changing and growing and figuring out what it needed to be for the size it was, which means that I don't know if I would be happy if I went back to Spotify today, but I know that now, right? If I look at other companies like Netflix is amazing because Netflix knows who it is, and Netflix is very upfront. You read the culture deck, if that doesn't make you excited, you would never go work there, and they're very happy for you not to. Amazon, same way, right? Amazon, we are who we are. This is what we care about. I don't know if they still make people build their own desks. I don't think they do, but that kind of mentality said, no, this is who we are. If you come here, this is who you need to want to be. I think that's a really important thing for any size of company. And I think that's, if you want to make a company that's going to grow well, kind of having that understanding of who you are is really important. The companies I've seen really struggle are companies where either the founder, the startups where I advise or mentor leaders at, the startups that really struggle are startups who think they want to be somebody they're not actually, or don't know who they want to be. And so they create all this cognitive dissonance within the company, within their employees. Their investors don't understand what they're trying to do. And especially if they're selling, you look at the problems that Uber had. You look at there's just a litany of companies that have had these struggles because who they said they were and who they were two different places, two different things.
Got it. Thanks. I think I find that to be true as well with the companies that I advise is say who you are. Don't say someone different because it's exactly that same kind of thing. So I agree with that. Let's go back to a little bit Conway's Law and re-architecting software development processes and org structures. When did you know, right? So here's the thesis of the question, is that org structures are like software architectures, and you re-architect them when the problems changed.
Mm-hmm.
So you've seen some of these architectures, some of these org designs change. What were clues to you to think of? So if we establish that you need to have an org design that follows your company values and your company goals, and then let's argue that you're successful at doing that, and there's some independence, and maybe these different teams learn from each other, then you have the Bill G internet moment when everything has to switch. Mm-hmm. Sometimes those come down, right? Bill G writes a memo, everyone salutes and says, yes, sir, because you're Bill Gates.
Right.
Oftentimes it doesn't happen quite so clearly as that. What are signals that you thought about looking for to change the software development practices or the org design model within technology groups?
So there's a difference between there's two different moments there. One is that, oh no, something's changed. We need to figure out how to address this new opportunity, this new challenge, whatever. And that is actually a little bit of an easier situation than I think what the normal situation is, which is over time, you build org debt, you build management debt in the same way you build technical debt. And that one's a little bit hard because you have to recognize it and then you have to do something about it. So if talking about the first case first, oh no, this just happened, we have to adjust. So I would say if you think that is going to be, if you're designing your organization to anticipate those kind of events, then you build an organization that is really resilient to let's throw everything up in the air and reorganize around this new opportunity. And a lot of startups, actually, it's not a bad way to start out as a startup, as you're trying to find your product market fit and you need to be super nimble and you don't have a ton of people. You got to be able to do that kind of thing. That shouldn't happen as much. Hopefully you don't have those kind of, oh no, the internet's here kind of moments. And when that happens, you're going to just do whatever you need to do to make that work. And you have to, Bill G, to your point, Bill G was Bill G. If a random palm at Microsoft said, oh no, the internet's coming, nothing would have happened. Nobody would have cared, right? There was not you needed Bill to say it. The other thing I actually think is a little bit more interesting, and it's only because it's so hard to recognize. Over time, just stuff isn't working quite as well as it used to, and you're not really sure why not. Just taking it, I don't know, stuff's moving slower, or we can't get stuff out without bugs, or, we're just releasing the wrong things. Customers aren't happy with the things we're releasing. And you look for 85 different ways because organizational structure was never the problem. And now it is, and it's really hard to recognize because generally people tend to have a lot invested in the organizational structure, especially if you're a leader there. And the last thing you want to do is have somebody kind of mess with this thing that you've built. One of the things I thought we did really well at Spotify, I still do, this is one of the little lessons I learned there, is we would have a quarterly offsite of the senior tech leadership, all the VPs and directors and the CTO. And we would the first question we'd say is is stuff working? Do we need to change it? There was no fealty to that Spotify model whatsoever. If it stopped working, we were ready to move on. And that is how we created things like alliances. We realized we've now scaled horizontally as far as we can. We spent 6 months trying to think of a way to scale without adding a new vertical layer before we just gave up and said, all right, well, we can't, we've tried everything else. This is the obvious thing. We didn't want to do it, but we're going to do that. And we were just constantly looking at things and saying, is it working? And if it's not, we made sure we would change it. That's the thing I bring now to every organization that I'm part of, is that revisiting, are things working? Do we need to change things? What should we be doing differently today? And just trying to teach the leaders in my organization that they shouldn't get too precious about this stuff. They should be really thinking about the company needs as opposed to sort of their own professional, how many people do I manage kind of things.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Let's do a reset and invite people to raise their hand. We have a few minutes left. So I'll let Alexander do a room reset and invite people to raise their hand if they have questions. Go ahead, Alexander.
Hi, everyone. Tonight's Fireside Chat is hosted by Interna and is the first of a series where we ask today's leaders in product and technology what they have learned and how to innovate on product, strategy, and technology. The interview is conducted by David Subar, and our special guest tonight is Kevin Goldsmith. If you have any questions for tonight's guest, if you have any questions for tonight's guest, direct message or tweet at David directly on Twitter. His handle is @DSubar, that's @DSUBAR, or you can follow the link on his Clubhouse profile. Additionally, right now you may raise your hand and ask a question directly on stage. Questions will be answered in the order they are received, but we are welcoming hands raised, so feel free to raise your hand. To contact Kevin after tonight's Fireside Chat, feel free to reach out to him on Twitter @Kevin Goldsmith. That's @KevinGoldsmith, or on his website, kevingoldsmith.com. His information should be in his bio. And then with David, you can contact David after tonight on Twitter @DSubar or on LinkedIn as David Subar. or the Interna website, interna.com/contact.
Excellent. There's a hand raised. I'm going to bring this person up. Garrett, you should be on stage. Go ahead.
Hey,
Go ahead.
Appreciate it, David, Alexander, and Kevin. Kevin, I had a question for you. As an early stage founder, I'm curious if you have any advice to scaling and growing the team vertically, and any things, particularly on the cultural side, that you might recommend either avoiding or attacking.
So are you a sole founder, or do you have a co-founder?
Co-founder. I came from a General Catalyst company, and we just got some pre-seed money from some VCs in Silicon.
So what the first thing I would do would be you and your co-founder, if you haven't already, sit down and talk about what do we both care a lot about. What do we care about, and what do we detest? And that is essentially your first collection of values. When you hire, look for people who look for people who at least share the majority of those values and don't display the things you detest. So if you detest politics, make sure that the people you're hiring don't come out that kind of don't have that kind of political bent. Or if I mean like office politics in this particular case, right? That's important, because if that's something, especially when you're early stage and you're really just trying to find talented people and you're not careful about, that early team is really going to decide what the company grows into. No matter what, it's the people you hire really determine that stuff. So that would be the first step, and just hire for values fit from the beginning. Because that's going to mean a lot. So the way I normally talk about it is like, if you like the office cold, don't hire somebody that can't stand, needs the office to be 80 degrees Fahrenheit. On the team scaling, the cool part about early stage startups is when the team is small, right? You think of Dunbar's number, which, 50, but certainly, I think about it as like, can you fit all in a single room? Whether you're virtual or whether you're co-located, you don't actually have to worry that much about structure, because stuff is just going to work out. It's really when you start getting past that you need to start thinking about it, because, in the early team, everybody's going to do whatever. You're trying to find people that are going to play all the positions, are going to do whatever they need to do. And that's a good thing, because the communication bandwidth is so high in that small group. As you get to that point where that's not really working out anymore, that's when you start thinking about, okay, well, how do we organize in a way that's going to make sense for our customer? Like, do we want to organize by our customer? Do we want to organize by problems to be solved? Do we have long-running features? Do we want to organize by features, markets? How do we want to organize? A lot of that's going to be determined by the company and how the company is growing. But you don't have to worry about, I wouldn't stress out about it until you really get to the point where you have to.
Awesome. Super, super valuable. I appreciate that. And I'm going to sneak one more question here, if you guys don't mind. Are there any...
Garrett, before you do that, let me just ask if anyone else wants to raise their hand, because we only have a few minutes left.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
So raise your hand now, Garrett. Sneak your question in, but I might cut Kevin off to let someone else if they have one. But go ahead.
And then Kevin, for the early employees, does it make sense to be doing one-on-ones as a lot of the information is free flowing and things along that nature? Is there any other things that you would recommend on that front?
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of it's going to depend on how you're structured. If you are co-located, I think the necessity of those kind of formal communication kind of things is lessened. Again, small group, everyone kind of knows what's going on because you're all sitting within a few feet of each other. If you're virtual, I do think that is actually more important and more valuable, because those kind of informal communications don't naturally happen. You don't overhear the conversations. You don't see the people visiting the office. Those kinds of things. So if you're going on a full virtual route, or if you're virtual right now because of the pandemic, I would actually put some time into making time for every one of the employees, knowing they have your ear until you either all show up in the office or until you start ending up with multiple levels of management.
Actually, this will be the first time tonight I disagree with Kevin.
Okay, good.
And even in small groups, I think one-on-ones are valuable. And the reason one-on-ones are valuable are not to trade as much information about what you're doing, but to trade information about who you are and to know people personally, to break the value of breaking bread with someone and learning about if they have a spouse, if they have kids, if they have a dog, if they have a cat, to know something about them is hugely valuable. And you don't get that in a relationship unless you devote some time to a person individually. So other than that, I agree with everything else Kevin said tonight.
I think that's totally fair. I think that kind of happens anyway, but if you want to do it formally, I think there's no reason not to.
Well, so we have. Sorry, Garrett, you had a quick question. It goes the other way.
Oh no, I was just going to say thank you. I appreciate both those replies. Very valuable.
So it is now the top of the hour, 7 p.m. on the in Pacific time zone. Some other time where each of you are, unless you're in India, in which case it's half an hour in. And so we're going to close the room. I'll let Alexander do some final comments. And I thank every one of you for showing up tonight. And I particularly thank Kevin for his insight and sharing his brilliance with us. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody. But
Thanks,
Alexander?
David. Thanks, David and Alexander.
Yes, and Kevin, if you have any last remarks that you want to say before I go ahead and close this out?
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to everyone. If you have other questions or anything else you'd like to chat about, feel free to. Twitter's probably the best way, or just reach out to me. They're always happy to talk to folks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. That concludes tonight's interview. If you enjoyed this interview, be sure to follow the speakers on social media by following the links in their respective bios. You can reach David on Twitter at DSubar. That's at DSUBAR. On LinkedIn, his name is David Subar. Or on the Interna website, interna.com/contact. And you can reach Kevin on Twitter at Kevin Goldsmith, at KevinGoldsmith, or on his website, kevingoldsmith.com. We'll leave the room open for one more minute for a final opportunity to connect elsewhere and continue the conversation. So thank you all for joining us, and have a good night.
And thank you again, Kevin. Kevin, I'll reach out to you offline and we'll chat some more.
Yep. Thanks.